Hello, my name is Carrie and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing my April and May wrap up. So in April, I technically only read one book. I'm going to talk about that one briefly and then I will go into what I read in May. In April, I only finished A Serial Killer's Guide to Marriage by McKay, and I'm not going to lie, this book really put me in a slump. I was looking for more of like a murder mystery or a thriller book, and this one is much more about the relationship between the main characters. We follow a couple, Hazel and Fox, who are former serial killers who renounced their life of crime because they had a child. At the start of the book, you realize they're in a really difficult spot in their relationship and they're trying to figure out, is this really worth working through? And I found this book to be really hard to read because of that. I was not in the mental headspace to read a story like this. It was very emotional, very heartbreaking at times, and I really struggled to make my way through the book because I was expecting something a little more lighthearted, humorous, again, kind of like maybe cozy mystery or at least like more humorous thriller vibes, because that is definitely how it's marketed, and that's not the story that this was. I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5 stars because I still thought that the exploration of these themes was well done. I felt like there were other parts of the story that were lacking, and it was just a book that I felt so many mixed feelings about, but I don't necessarily think it was a bad book. I think the way that I went into this book was incorrect, and that is a reader problem, not necessarily the book itself's problem. So that was my one April read, and I definitely was in a little bit of a slump because I finished that one in the beginning of April. I read actually most of it in March. For the rest of April, I really did not have a desire to read anything. It was really difficult. However, by the time we got to May, I was binge reading a lot of things. I went on a vacation at the beginning of the month, and my school year was starting to wind down towards the end of the month. So there was a lot more time for reading, which is why in May I ended up finishing 9 books. 5 of those were audiobooks, 3 were physical books, and 1 was an ebook. On to author backgrounds. So the authors that I read from, 3 were white authors, 4 were Asian authors, although there was a mix of like East and South Asian, and 2 were African American authors. The majority of the countries I read from were Western centric, so Canada, the United States, England, Ireland, and then I read 1 book by a South Korean author. Obviously, the authors that wrote these books often have multi-ethnic backgrounds, so there is still a diversity in where they come from, the cultures that they originate from. But I have been noticing recently that I have been reading a lot more books from Canadian, American, and British authors, so I do need to really expand out more to other countries. And there were 2 books this month that either were written by LGBTQ+ authors or had LGBTQ+ themes in them. My average star rating was about 3.6 stars, which was surprising because I felt like a lot of the books that I read this month were kind of somewhere in the middle. I didn't know for some of the books what my full thoughts were on them. However, I still felt better about my reading this month. I felt like there were more books that I was actually enjoying. So I'm happy to see that that is finally increasing, because the last time that was calculated, I was in the trenches. Now on to the books that I read in May. I started the month off with The Case of the Missing Marquess by Nancy Springer. This is the first book in the Enola Holmes series, and I really love the films that were adapted from these books. So I was excited to find out it was a series and start those. I really enjoyed the first book. I think it aligns well with the movie adaptation, but of course there are still differences. I really liked the writing style. I thought it had that humorous nature to it that really endears me to Enola Holmes, and her character was just so lively and so fun. I do think I will continue on with this series. However, it is a middle grade mystery series. It's not necessarily groundbreaking. It wasn't the best book I've ever read. However, it's a fun adventure series that I can see myself enjoying between heavier reads. So I will be planning to continue on with this one. I gave the first one 4 out of 5 stars, and I feel pretty confident in how I rated it because at the time it was a lighthearted, fast-paced read. I ended up listening to this one on audio and I finished it all within just a couple hours because it was one of those books that I could really stay focused on and just had a fun time with. Next, I read The Swimmers by Julie Otsuka. This is a weird book. I'm gonna say that. It's the story of a community swimming pool, but also the story of a woman who swims in the community pool and the story of her family and like the societal beliefs around community, care, memory loss, things like this. I really loved this book. I understand why a lot of people criticize this book and its writing style. It is a very weird writing style. It's a nested story, but it's a unique take on the nested story. I thought the author did this marvelously. I think this story was very unique, and it's not like something I've read before, and I think that was a positive here. I really loved the societal themes that this author explored in understanding community, understanding our family dynamics, and how you never really fully know your family until there's a point where you start to realize you may lose them and lose their memories. There's also this exploration of care for the elderly and how community itself can be care, but only to a certain extent. And same for families wanting to care for their loved ones. There are times where that's not possible, and managing those expectations, understanding the environment that you may potentially be putting a family member in. These are all aspects that I thought were explored with nuance in this story. While I understand some reviewers saying this felt like a series of disconnected novellas, I actually felt like the themes across each section really overlapped well and really left me with a lot to think about. I do think there are times where I was reading this and I was also saying, what is going on here? Like, what am I reading? But for me, things came together. I ended up giving it a 4 to 5 stars. It's a book that I have thought a lot about though in the aftermath, and one that I have found myself recommending to people. And I think that's a sure sign that this is a book I really enjoyed and that left a lasting impression on me. Next, I read a book that finally made a dent in my library book stack. This is a growing stack that I have been trying to decrease, and finally I read an anthology from this. I read The Fire This Time by Jesmyn Ward, well, edited by Jesmyn Ward. There's many contributors to this essay/poetry collection. It's a collection of ruminations on the African American experience post Baldwin's generation and discussions about race and life in the United States. I thought this book was very interesting. Obviously, some essays were more impactful than others, but I thought that there was a good mix of themes in this, of different experiences, different backgrounds, different life that has been lived by these different people, and yet there were still these common themes that helped tie the overarching mission of this anthology together, because the anthology is trying to highlight that many of the issues in Baldwin's time are still issues that we face today, that American society hasn't fully faced, and what kind of repercussions this has on African American communities. And a lot of the stories in this were written after the murders of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown. And I grew up in St. Louis. I remember the period of time after the murder of Michael Brown and the community's reaction to that. So this is something that I have a lived experience in, of a very different background. You know, obviously this was like the first time that something so large happened in my area, and I'm not denying that it had happened before then. St. Louis Police Department has a history of violence and brutality. That is definitely something that existed long before Michael Brown's murder. However, I remember the atmosphere at that time. I had just left for college. I was coming back when there was the announcement that his murder would not be taken to trial. And I remember everyone in my hometown talking about this. The way that this highlighted a national issue in a local context for me at that age. I also was really reflecting on the period in 2020 of the national response to George Floyd's murder, and I mean even international. There are, you know, I'm living on the complete opposite side of the world now, and there are still students who are aware of who George Floyd is, and they have an understanding of that piece of American history. Yeah, there were a lot of things in this book that I was reflecting on, connecting to the present day still, obviously. We still see many issues with these problems that are being discussed in this book. But there were also stories about African American figures who are kind of like lost to history. There was mention of the first African American poet, and in a poetry collection I was reading recently, this poet was discussed in there, and I had the background from this book to know about that. There's a woman who goes to James Baldwin's house in the south of France and realizes that it's not being preserved, and this aspect of history is both French and American history, but it's not being cared about. There were just a lot of things in this book that made me reflect on modern African American history and what type of legacy, you know, our education curriculum, our history books are going to say about this period. Because, I mean, obviously with things currently happening, there is an active erasure of these experiences. And so books like this become even more important in conveying the realities of African American experiences in the United States. Really impactful book. I would really highly recommend this one. I think it would also be interesting for people outside of the United States because this has such a background that I think would be very accessible to readers, both American and non-American. I gave that one 4 out of 5 stars. It has made me interested to read more from many of the authors that were featured in this collection. Some of them I had read from before and some of them were new to me. So it's always exciting to find new authors that you can read from. Then I read Intermezzo by Sally Rooney. I have to be honest, I read all of Intermezzo in April except for the very last hour of the audiobook, because I was so angry. I was reading this one for a book club. There's an in-person book club in my city that I attend regularly, and this was our April pick. I had the last hour left of this, and I was getting very frustrated with the story. In book club, they've told me what happened, and when I found out what happened, I was very angry. And so I put off finishing it and finally finished it in May. This is the story of 2 brothers, Ivan and Peter, who are, I think, Polish-Irish. And their father has died at the beginning of the book, and the rest of the book kind of explores them as individuals, and then also this very odd dynamic that they have between them as siblings. There is an age gap between the siblings, and my older brother and I also had an age gap. So I could really relate to these characters in some aspects of understanding that kind of complicated sibling dynamic where one of you is an adult and one is still a child, and it's very hard to kind of meet in the middle or be understanding towards each other at times because you're in such different phases of life. However, I have to say, I hated Peter in this. Peter is the older brother who is so incredibly hypocritical. Everything is like a fake image for him. He is so emotionally stunted and he is so antagonistic. I really could not stand this character, and I didn't like his dynamic in this book with the partners that he has. I really liked Ivan as a character, and Ivan eventually develops a relationship in this book that I really loved the exploration of. A lot of this book, though, is about loneliness and how Ivan and Peter seek out different relationships. A part of that is combating loneliness. I loved Ivan's exploration because I thought it was more nuanced. There's this conversation that happens in the book where Ivan hears someone say, "I love you," and it's the first time someone has told him that they love him since his father has died. And there's this deep reflection that he has on why this affects him so greatly and how he had never thought about this. And this was fascinating to me because one of my good friends was reading a book with a main character who lost their parents when they were very young. They are meeting like a partner's parents, and the mom hugs him, and it's this moment where he says, like, this is the first time in over a decade that I've had a mom hug. We were talking about this experience of these characters and talking about these things that will eventually happen to everyone one day. I mean, there's always going to be a point where, like, you know, you're not going to be able to hug your parents, or you are not going to be able to hear "I love you" from them. And trying to understand the mindset of those characters and how both authors talk about this experience in a way that is so heartbreaking because it was just so intense. Apologies if the angle is a little different. I had a grocery order that was delivered, so I'm just now getting back to this. But I do think that Sally Rooney has a certain way of writing that means these very emotional scenes are very impactful. And she has a way of writing characters that feel very raw, very real. Sometimes that can be a good thing in the case of Ivan, and sometimes that can be a bad thing in the case of Peter. I think that her characters do really feel like real lived people, but sometimes people are shit and you don't want to read about those characters. And that's how I felt about Peter. I really could not care about what was happening with him. I was very angry with how that story turned out because I do feel in this book that Sally Rooney did not develop the female characters enough, and they felt a lot like plot devices in this story and not real people, whereas Peter and Ivan felt very realized, and that was very disappointing for me in this story. I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars, and this is something I'm starting to realize with Sally Rooney's writing, is that I enjoy her writing and the way that she can express emotions and people's beliefs, but sometimes the characters are just characters that I need more to actually like them. And in her stories, I find if I don't like characters, it's really hard for me to continue to care about their stories. I am thankful that this one was a book club book because many people in my book club had very differing opinions on it, felt either very strongly for it or very strongly against it. I fell somewhere in the middle, and so I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5 stars. But it was interesting to me how controversial this book was because many people expressed that they really struggled through this one. And I found it very readable. I didn't think it lagged in any area or that it was difficult to get through, but I found myself getting increasingly frustrated with the characters in it, for sure. Then I read She of the Mountains by Vivek Shraya. This is a poetry collection, and I love Vivek Shraya's work. I've read almost all of their work, I think, at this point. I might have like 1 or 2 left. They've written nonfiction essay collections, poetry collections, I think a fiction book as well. I think the fiction book is the one that I haven't read yet. And this is part memoir of their experience coming out as queer and becoming a trans woman while in a marriage to a cis woman, and realizing like this was something that needed to change in their life, even though they deeply loved this person. So it explores like the first romantic relationships that the author has, trying to understand that their identity. And then later it incorporates Hindu myths into the story. I thought this was fascinating. It's a blend of memoir and poetry and mythology that was really beautifully done. I also love Vivek Shraya narrates their own books, and I just love this narration style so much. I think it's very lyrical because I believe the author is also a musician, so that I think really tracks for me. This one, I felt like I didn't connect with as much as the other works by this author. I gave it a 3.5 out of 5 stars because I really enjoyed this collection, but there were parts where I struggled through it. I ended up re-listening to it and writing down a lot of the myths that were talked about so that I could go back and do more research. And since doing that, I've understood certain sections more, but I felt like I didn't have enough background information on this to fully understand it the first time that I listened to these things. So it was hard for me to fully enjoy everything because some things definitely went over my head. Then I read the May book for my book club, and that was We Do Not Part by Han Kang. I did not realize this book was translated by 2 different translators. It was not translated by Deborah Smith, and I want to say I noticed a difference in writing style here. I felt like there were parts of the book that were really beautifully written, and there were other parts where the language was odd. It was very confusing, and I found this fascinating because one of my book club members actually read the book in German, and she is a translator, and she felt the translation was really bad. She really struggled through this, and we found out in talking about this that in the German version, they create an accent for a regional accent that's discussed in the book. In the American version, they don't at all. And so that's a huge difference in reading experiences, in my opinion. If you are writing a book where there is a regional accent that is expressed in some languages but not in others. I want to bring this up because I think this is the first book of Han Kang's where I feel very negative about the writing style of this book. I felt like the whole time I was reading this book, I was wondering what is going on in this. In the first part of the book, we meet a writer and her friend Incheon. She is originally from Jeju Island, and she has had this accident and needs the writer to go to her hometown to take care of this bird that is very beloved by her. The writer goes to the hometown, and that is the first part of the book. You would think she was going across the Dyatlov Pass to get back to this town. It was insane. And then the second part of the book is a very different story, and I don't know if it was magical realism, if it was all a hallucination, if it's horror, if it is literary fiction. It was so confusing. I really did not understand why this narrative structure was chosen. And with the story that this book is actually centered around once we get to that second part, I think it's a very odd choice to structure a book like this with such a difficult subject matter to be something where someone is questioning, is this real, is this fiction? Maybe Han Kang is trying to ask ourselves, like, what blurs that line between real and fake? And in a time where misinformation is rampant, but we're also seeing these horrific events happen on the daily, like, how are there people that still deny this, that still like believe that this is fiction? I could see that argument being made that that was the point of this book, but I still have issues with the structure of it, because even at the end of the book, I was talking with my book club members. All of us couldn't fully understand what the structure meant in terms of the story. all of us felt like we didn't really understand certain aspects of this book in many different ways, especially the ending. I don't know, I just had very complex feelings about this book. I think this still has some of the core elements of Han Kang's writing, that there are these very horrific events that she has a way of expressing in such a nuanced and beautiful way, and exploring and bringing to light historical events that may not be well known outside of South Korea. In this book, there is a historical event that none of us in book club were aware of before reading this. And all of us did further research about this and learned more about it and learned more about the history of South Korea. And I think this is an amazing book in prompting so many readers to be so curious about this and to learn more about South Korea. We talked about our impressions of South Korea and how this knowledge changed our understanding of the history of South Korea in modern times. I just struggled a bit too much with the actual story here. And like, even now, I can't understand what genre this was supposed to be. I feel like I should know by the time a book ends what actual genre this book should be considered. And I don't. I ended up giving it 3 stars. I'm honestly thinking of just removing a star rating because I don't think that I can say like this is definitely where this falls for me, because I have so many mixed emotions about this book. After reading such a haunting book, I was feeling some poetry again, and so I picked up Bread and Circus by Airea D. Matthews. And this is a poetry collection that I'm so glad I listened to on audio, because it's a blend of quotes from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and the poems from the poet. I believe the poet was an economics student and was kind of horrified by Adam Smith's theory about the Wealth of Nations and the invisible hand and all of that. So this book is kind of her response to this and her reflections on growing up, her socioeconomic status throughout her life and the way this made her feel, her relationships with her family and their socioeconomic status, how socioeconomic status affects many different parts of people's lives. I thought that audiobook was phenomenal because there's the quotes from Wealth of Nations and then there's the poet like talking over it. And I really wonder what this would look like in physical form, because I think that would be really difficult to know when you're reading. Like, you need to be reading this while simultaneously reading this. It was such an interesting concept that I just don't think I've read anything like this before. I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 to 5 stars, and this was my first time reading anything from this poet. I definitely look forward to reading more from them in the future, because I cannot even comprehend the amount of creativity that was required to think of something like this. Like, it truly feels like such a groundbreaking, refreshing perspective on poetry, and I just really, really enjoyed it. Then I read World of Wonders by Aimee Nezukahtathil, and I previously have only read poetry collections from this author before. She's very well known though for her environmental poetry and writing, and this was no exception. This is an essay collection on the natural world and animals, but it's also a part memoir of her experience growing up in so many different places around the world. There were so many beautiful reflections in this on animals, and animals that like I enjoy learning about, but also ones that I had no prior information about. I was constantly looking things up while reading this, and there's just such a way that the author has in both describing the natural world and also their love of it. And although at times this was really emotional and it could be very heavy with some of the themes that the author is talking about, there were times where it was very humorous and other times where it was deeply serious and reflective, but it was beautiful regardless. And the writing style in this is just so poetic. I really love Aimee's writing, and I am so thankful for books like this, because I was reading this just as we were starting to get really nice weather here, and I had been on a vacation earlier in the month where we went to a more tropical part of the country where there were so many beautiful plants, and reading this book reminded me of like why I stopped to see those plants and how fascinated I was by them, and just those little beautiful pieces of life that sometimes get very easily overlooked. One of my very close friends from graduate school recommended this one to me years ago, and I just kept putting it off. And I ended up getting an audio copy through my local library that was read by the author, and it was so lovely. Oh, yes, a great read for sure. Then the last book that I read in May, which I actually finished the month of May with, was I Hope You Remember by Josie Balka. I was unaware of who Josie Balka was before this. This is one that I just randomly requested on NetGalley because I am always looking for more poetry recommendations. I find on NetGalley there can be some really interesting collections that are coming out that I don't hear about mainly on social media. This was one of those. This author is a Canadian broadcaster. I don't know if it's a radio show or like a podcast show, but apparently is well known through this media like personality. This is a book that is divided into 3 sections. So the 3 sections are loving, longing, living. I found the first 2 sections of poems to be much more impactful for me personally. I found that they resonated with me a lot more. The last section had some gems, but the last section was experimenting a lot more with poetry styles, and I don't think it really worked out well. My biggest issue with this collection was actually the lack of structure and organization. There's not full breaks between the poems, so there were times where I could not understand where one poem was ending and another was beginning. I struggled to understand if some of these were supposed to be like train of thought poems or like a monologue. I really couldn't understand the structural choices behind this collection, besides dividing them into the themes. I think there needed to be better structure. I also think the organization of some poems confused me because there were some where I felt like that was related to something I had read earlier, but it felt literally like a continuation of a poem that had like 5 other poems in the middle. So organizational issues and structural issues were aplenty in this collection. I think that this might be a collection that would appeal to people who have not read poetry before or who have a very limited experience with it. These are themes that many people would be able to relate to, and you could see very different poetry styles in this one collection. However, if you've read a lot of poetry, I think the organization and structure would bother you much more than other readers. So I think it's one you have to kind of pick your audience for. And I have to remind myself, this is a debut poet. This is her first collection. So these are natural things that happen in first collections, and it's something that can be developed over time. So overall, I gave that one 3 out of 5 stars, but that was how I ended May. And so those are all the books I have to talk to you guys about today. If you've read any of these, please leave a comment down below sharing your thoughts on them. Or if you want to share what you read in May, I would love to hear what you've been reading. I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you so much for watching. Happy reading. Bye.